The Iliad is a poem about justice. It's about the difference between revenge and justice. And I think there's something optimistic, there's something noble about the vision of justice within the city on the shield of Achilles. And it's telling that Homer, who lived on the cusp between the Dark Ages and the archaic period of Greece, who was there at the birth of the polis, would place the murder trial as one of the symbols of the city at peace, because it represents the difference between revenge and true justice, and the fact that that is fundamental to what we would consider civilization. The Iliad provides precious testimony to what homicide law was like in these early societies. And in fact, remember that Homer lives on this borderline between the Dark Ages of Greece, when really society is stateless, there's no clear government, it's a warrior society organized around warrior households, it's a deeply primitive agricultural pastoralist economy with little trade, with no writing, with no written law, in which all affairs are basically private. And Homer lives on the edge between that kind of society and the rise of the polis, with formal, with permanent institutions, with laws, and soon-to-be written laws. And Homer shows us the way that homicide law could work between these two kinds of society. And in fact, we see that repeatedly throughout the Iliad, which reflects in many cases an earlier kind of Dark Age stateless society, that homicide is purely private. And that is so alien to us that it requires us to ponder on, to try and imagine ourselves back into a world where homicide is a purely private affair. And throughout the world that's depicted in the Iliad, throughout this society, we see numerous cases throughout the book, throughout the poem, where the consequence of homicide is considered purely private and the retribution for homicide is a payment. This is characteristic of many early societies, that homicide is punished with a payment. And in fact, that in itself is only one of two options, because in this kind of society, when someone is murdered, it is the obligation of the kin of that person to exact revenge. And in fact, it's one of the ways that these societies regulate themselves is through the fear of someone's kin seeking revenge upon you. And so in this society, revenge is fundamental to the law, the customs that surround the punishment of homicide. But within this kind of society grows up an alternative to pure revenge, and that is payment, blood price, a payment that could be made by the perpetrator of a murder to the kin in order to buy off, to pay off, to make recompense for the crime. It's again very alien to our minds. We can't imagine in our society that a murderer could simply pay his way to the victim's family and avoid jail. But think about it. This is a society without jails, without prisons. This is a society without a state, without judges, without police. Imagine that kind of world. What else is it supposed to do if someone commits murder? And in fact, I think we can see the development of homicide law as going through a series of stages, and from more primitive to more civilized. And those are value terms, and we should recognize that, but that's acceptable, because we wouldn't want to live in a primitive society with a homicide law that accepted revenge or payment. And in fact, one of the messages of Homer's Iliad is that the state of civilization is superior. It represents an advance upon the purely vengeful society that preceded it. So imagine what we might think of as 4 stages. The earliest stage is one in which murder is a purely private wrong. It's like what we would consider in our society a tort. It's not a crime and it's not a contractual violation. It's simply a wrong that can be done through retribution. It can be undone through retribution. And so in this primitive stage, murder is a purely private concern between 2 clans, between 2 groups of kinsmen. In a more advanced stage, what we might consider coercive summons or state-mediated. That is, that there is some kind of society, there's some kind of state institution that can mediate between the 2 parties, between the murderer and the murderers and the family of the person who's been murdered. And in fact, this is the stage of society that's depicted on the shield of Achilles, because there you have a city where there are judges who are arbitrating, who are mediating. And so there's a system somehow of coercive summons that somehow you can be coerced to go before a board of mediators or judges who will determine what is the appropriate penalty, what is the appropriate payment, especially in cases where one family won't accept a monetary payment in exchange for the murder of one of their kinsmen. And in the world of the Iliad, you see this kind of society taking shape. But it's worth noting that in this second stage, murder is still considered a private wrong. It's still an injury between two parties, the murderer and the murdered. In a slightly more advanced stage, what we might consider a third stage, that would actually begin to develop in the next century in classical Athens, murder's considered more than just a private wrong between two parties. It's considered, in some sense, a public crime. And you see begin to develop institutions that make murder a public crime. One of the most signal of these institutions, and one that's characteristic of archaic Athens, is the institution of third-party prosecution. Think about what this means. It means that, in fact, if I murder someone in your family doesn't have to press charges, but in fact, a third party can get involved. That inherently makes this kind of crime a public affair, and it represents an advance in civilization towards a more just system, because it means that murder, it recognizes that murder is in fact more than just a private wrong. It's somehow a disruption of the social fabric, of the society itself. Now that's as advanced as murder as homicide law becomes in the ancient world. But it's worth saying that there's, in some sense, in the abstract, a fourth or more developed stage, the one that we're familiar with. And in fact, it's the one that is expressed by the introduction to one of the most successful TV series of all time, Law and Order. The police investigate crimes, and the prosecutors who pursue the offenders. That's our system in which crimes are completely public. There's a police system that tries to investigate them. There's a prosecutor system that will try the offenders. But this is a very, very different world from the ancient societies in which the law of homicide took shape. And to appreciate the world of Homer, we must recognize that he exists in this much earlier society when the law of homicide was just beginning to use procedure and public institutions to replace purely private vengeance.